Hey guys! What if, for one quiet evening, you could step into a Persian tavern more than 2,000 years ago? Before that, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comment where you tuning from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. The sun has just disappeared beyond the hills. Oil lamps flicker beneath a wooden doorway, warm light spills onto the dusty street, and the soft murmur of travelers drifts into the evening air. Tonight, we step inside and slowly discover what it was like to visit a Persian tavern. Walking toward the tavern, evening settles over the Persian town. Evening arrived slowly over the ancient Persian town, as though the day itself were reluctant to disappear. Beyond the low hills surrounding the settlement, the sun had begun its final descent. Its warm light stretched across the landscape, touching fields, gardens, walls, and rooftops with a soft golden glow. The pale surfaces of the mud brick buildings seemed almost luminous beneath the fading sunlight, while long shadows gradually spread across the narrow streets. For most of the day, the town had been filled with movement. Merchants had called out from their stalls. Donkeys had carried baskets through crowded lanes. Wooden carts had creaked beneath their loads. Craftsmen had worked in small workshops, while travelers had passed through the streets carrying the dust of distant roads upon their clothing. But now the working day was coming to an end. One by one, the merchants of the marketplace began putting away their goods. Lengths of woven cloth disappeared into wooden chests. Baskets of dates and dried fruits were carried indoors. Clay vessels were gathered carefully from the edges of stalls. Small piles of herbs and spices were protected from the evening air. The sounds of commerce gradually became quieter. A final bargain was made. A final customer departed. A wooden shutter closed. Then another. The marketplace began to surrender itself to the night. Elsewhere in the town, ordinary households were preparing their evening meals. From open courtyards came the smell of bread warming near a fire. Herbs were being crushed and mixed into simple dishes. Dates and other dried fruits were being placed upon household tables. Water was being carried indoors, and cooking fires gave off thin trails of smoke that rose gently into the darkening air. The evening breeze carried these scents through the streets. Warm bread, dry earth, fresh herbs, smoke, and, in places, the faint sweetness of grapes. The atmosphere was changing with every passing moment. The heat that had pressed upon the town during the afternoon was becoming less intense. The stone and mud brick walls slowly released the warmth they had absorbed from the sun, while the air became cooler and more comfortable. A donkey stood quietly beside a wall. Its load had already been removed, and there was little left for it to do except wait. Nearby, a wooden cart moved slowly along the road. Its wheels made a soft, repeating sound against the packed earth. Creak. Pause. Creak. Then even that sound disappeared into the distance. The first oil lamps were being lit. Their flames were small and delicate, especially beneath the enormous evening sky. One appeared beside a doorway, followed by another farther down the street. Soon, small points of warm light could be seen throughout the settlement. There was something peaceful about the transition. Ancient towns did not suddenly become dark. Instead, daylight faded gradually, and people adapted their activities to the changing light. The sky above the rooftops turned from gold to pale blue. Then from blue to deeper violet. The first stars appeared. At the edge of town, the surrounding landscape became a dark silhouette beneath the evening sky. The great Persian world stretched far beyond this modest settlement, connecting cities, roads, estates, caravan routes, and royal centers across an enormous empire. Yet here, on this particular evening, life was much simpler. People were finishing their work. Families were eating. Travelers were looking for somewhere to rest. And in one quiet part of the town, a small tavern was beginning to fill with the gentle sounds of evening. The building itself was modest. Its entrance was sheltered beneath a simple covering, protecting it from the strong sun of the day and offering a little shade to those standing outside. An oil lamp burned beside the doorway. Its flame moved gently in the breeze, casting a small pool of light onto the ground. Beyond the entrance, the interior was warm and dim. Low tables stood beneath the lamps. Clay cups and vessels rested upon them. Simple cushions provided places to sit. The walls were plain, their surfaces catching the shifting shadows of the flames. There was no need for grandeur. This was not a royal hall. It was a place for ordinary evenings. A merchant might arrive after closing his stall. A worker might come after finishing a long day. A traveler might enter after spending hours on the road. Someone might simply come because the evening was pleasant and there were friends inside. The tavern offered a temporary pause from the demands of daily life. Inside, bread was being broken and shared. Small dishes of food were placed upon tables. Drinks were poured into clay vessels. Conversations began quietly, sometimes concerning the day's work, sometimes the weather, sometimes the condition of the roads, and sometimes distant places that many of those listening might never see. The sounds blended together. A cup touched wood. Someone laughed softly. A chair or cushion shifted. A voice rose briefly above the others, then settled again. From somewhere within the room came the faintest suggestion of music. Outside, the town continued growing quieter. The marketplace was almost completely still now. Doors were closing. Children were being called indoors. Animals were settling into their resting places. The last workers were returning home beneath the stars. Only the tavern remained gently awake. Its lamps shone through the doorway. Warm light touched the dusty street. The scent of food drifted outside. And the quiet murmur of human voices continued beneath the vast Persian night. It was a small scene, almost ordinary. Yet it revealed something important about life in the ancient world. Beyond palaces, armies, royal ceremonies, and monumental architecture, there were evenings like this one. People worked. People became tired. People searched for food and companionship. And when the long day finally ended, they gathered beneath the warm light of simple lamps. The darkness deepened above the town. More stars appeared. The hills became almost invisible. The streets fell silent. But inside the modest tavern, the evening was only beginning. The lamps continued to flicker. The tables remained occupied. The bread was still warm. And the soft voices of ancient Persia carried gently into the night. Finding the tavern. By the time the last colors of sunset had disappeared from the sky, the small Persian town had become almost entirely a world of shadows and lamplight. The streets were quieter now. The marketplace, which only hours earlier had been crowded with merchants, customers, animals, and carts, had settled into darkness. Wooden stalls stood closed beneath the night sky. Cloth awnings hung motionless. Baskets and jars had been carried indoors, and the day's merchandise had been carefully stored away. Only the occasional sound of footsteps disturbed the silence. From somewhere beyond the houses came the distant braying of a donkey. Then came silence again. Above the rooftops, the stars had become numerous and bright. Without the constant glow of a modern city, the night sky seemed enormous. The Milky Way stretched faintly across the darkness, while the moon cast a pale light over the flat roofs and narrow lanes. The streets themselves were illuminated only here and there. An oil lamp burned beside one doorway. Another rested near a small courtyard. A third flickered beneath a wooden shelter. Their light was gentle and limited, leaving large portions of the street in darkness. Near one of the quieter lanes, however, a warmer glow could be seen. It came from the entrance of the tavern. The small building had become more noticeable now that most of the town had gone quiet. During daylight, it might have looked almost ordinary. At night, the light made it feel different. A faint smell of cooked food drifted through the doorway. Warm bread, herbs, fruit, and the earthy scent of clay vessels mingled with the smoke of small lamps. The tavern's entrance remained open. There was no heavy door separating the inside from the street. Instead, the opening allowed cool night air to move through the room, carrying with it the distant sense of the town. A few people stood near the entrance, speaking in low voices. Their clothing showed the practical character of everyday Persian life. Simple woven garments were suited to the climate and to the work people performed. Some carried signs of travel, with dust upon their sandals and clothing. Others appeared to have come directly from the nearby streets. The tavern was not a place reserved for one particular kind of person. Its visitors could include merchants, laborious, travelers, craftsmen, and others looking for food, drink, conversation, or simply a place to spend part of the evening. Inside, the room was arranged simply. Low tables occupied the central space. Clay cups and bowls were placed upon them. Cushions and simple seating areas surrounded the tables, allowing people to sit comfortably while eating and talking. The walls were plain. The ceiling was supported by practical wooden elements, and small lamps provided most of the illumination. Their flames moved gently whenever the evening breeze entered through the doorway. The light created soft patterns across the room. Faces appeared briefly in the glow before fading into shadow. Hands moved across tables. Cups were lifted. Bread was torn into pieces. The whole room seemed to move at an unhurried pace. There was no reason to rush. The workday was finished. The evening belonged to conversation and rest. At one table, a group of merchants spoke quietly about the road. Their conversation moved from one subject to another. They might discuss the price of goods, the condition of a road, the arrival of a caravan, or news carried from another settlement. For travelers, such places could be valuable sources of information. Long journeys across the Persian world depended upon roads, animals, water, food, and knowledge of places along the route. A tavern could therefore be more than somewhere to eat. It could be a place where information traveled. A merchant might hear about conditions farther along the road. A traveler might learn which settlement lay ahead. A local might hear news from distant regions without ever leaving the town. In this way, ordinary conversations could connect people across enormous distances. But not every conversation was serious. There was laughter too. Someone at the back of the room told a story, and several listeners smiled. Another voice answered. The room briefly became louder. Then the laughter softened again. The atmosphere remained relaxed. Near the entrance, a server moved quietly between the tables, carrying clay vessels and simple dishes. The work was familiar and repetitive. Food arrived. Empty vessels were collected. More drinks were poured. The lamps were watched and tended. The evening continued. Outside, the air had become noticeably cooler. The heat stored by the walls throughout the day was gradually disappearing. A breeze moved through the narrow street and entered the tavern, causing the flames to tremble. For a moment, the room became darker. Then the lamps steadied again. Beyond the doorway, the town seemed almost asleep. Yet the tavern remained awake. This contrast was perhaps the most noticeable feature of the evening. Outside was darkness, silence, and cool air. Inside was warmth, light, food, and human voices. The tavern created a small circle of life within the darkness. There were no bright signs announcing its presence. No loud music carried through the entire town. Only the gentle glow of its lamps suggested that people were still gathered there. As the night continued, more visitors arrived. Some came from nearby streets. Others appeared to have traveled farther. A few carried small belongings with them. Their arrival brought brief movement to the quiet room. A greeting. A place prepared at a table. A cup filled. A meal served. Then the newcomer settled into the evening like everyone else. Gradually, the sounds blended together once more. The tavern had found its nighttime rhythm. Quiet voices. Soft laughter. The occasional clink of pottery. The faint crackle of a lamp. The smell of food. And beyond it all, the vast silence of the Persian night. The world outside seemed very far away. There were no royal announcements here. No marching armies. No formal ceremonies. Only ordinary people sharing the final hours of an ordinary day. That simplicity is what made such an evening memorable. The ancient Persian Empire was enormous, stretching across many lands and peoples, but its history was also made in places like this. In small rooms. At simple tables. Under flickering lamps. Among people whose names would never be written into royal inscriptions. The tavern offered a glimpse into that quieter world. As the night deepened, the lamps continued burning. The food slowly disappeared from the tables. The conversations became softer. Some visitors prepared to leave. Others remained, enjoying the warmth and companionship a little longer. Outside, the stars shone above the silent rooftops. Inside, the tavern remained peaceful. Its simple doorway stood open to the cool night air, while warm lamplight continued to spill onto the ancient street. For another few hours, this small room would remain a gathering place beneath the Persian sky. And slowly, gently, the evening would move deeper into night. Entering the Persian Tavern. The first impression. Inside the small Persian tavern, the atmosphere was warmer than the quiet street outside. The evening air entered through the open doorway, but most of the room remained protected from the coolness of the night. A handful of oil lamps provided the only significant light, their flames moving gently whenever a breeze passed through the room. The light was soft. Nothing was brightly illuminated. The corners of the tavern remained shadowed, while the tables and people closest to the lamps appeared clearly for a moment before fading again into the surrounding darkness. This was the kind of light that encouraged people to slow down. The walls were simple, probably made from mud brick and covered with a layer of plaster. They carried the marks of ordinary use. There was no need for elaborate decoration in a place intended mainly for eating, drinking, resting, and conversation. The floor was practical and hard beneath the feet. Low tables occupied much of the central space. Around them were simple places to sit, including cushions or woven materials that made long evenings more comfortable. Clay vessels stood everywhere. Some were filled with water, while others contained drinks or food. The pottery had a familiar earthy appearance. Some pieces were plain. Others may have carried simple painted or incised designs. In the warm lamplight, even ordinary objects took on a gentle beauty. A clay cup could catch the light along its rim. A wooden table could appear golden beneath the flame. A bowl of fruit could cast a small shadow across the surface beside it. The room was not silent. It was filled with many small sounds that blended together into one continuous murmur. Voices came from different corners. Some conversations were quiet and serious. Others were lighter. Occasionally, laughter rose above the general noise before disappearing again. Cups were placed upon tables. Food was moved from one dish to another. A cushion shifted beneath someone's weight. From outside came the occasional sound of footsteps passing along the street. All of these sounds belonged to the evening. None lasted very long. Nothing demanded attention for more than a moment. That gentle mixture of sound gave the tavern its character. It was a place where people could remain for hours without needing to do anything particularly important. The day's work was already finished. The roads could wait until morning. The marketplace was closed. The fields were dark. For a while, there was simply food, drink, conversation, and rest. The smell inside the room was equally varied. Warm bread provided one of the strongest scents. There were also herbs, cooked vegetables, fruit, and other foods that could be prepared and served without great ceremony. The scent of grapes lingered around some of the vessels. Smoke from the oil lamps added another layer to the air. Together, these smells created the unmistakable atmosphere of an ancient evening meal. Nothing smelled artificial. Everything came from things that had been prepared, cooked, stored, or burned within the small room. Near one wall, several clay storage vessels stood together. They were practical objects, useful for keeping food and liquids. Large jars could hold supplies, while smaller vessels could be used for serving. The presence of such pottery was ordinary, but it also revealed how closely everyday life depended upon simple materials. Clay was everywhere in the ancient Near East. It could become a cup, a bowl, a jar, a cooking vessel, or countless other objects. In a tavern, these humble materials became part of the entire evening. A drink was poured from one vessel into another. Bread was served beside a clay bowl. Water waited nearby. Food passed from table to table. The objects were not remarkable individually, but together they created the practical world of the tavern. At one table, a group of people spoke about the day's business. At another, travelers listened to local conversation. Some customers appeared familiar with one another. Others were strangers who had only recently arrived. A tavern naturally brought different lives into the same room. A merchant could sit near a craftsman. A traveler could share space with a local resident. Someone who had spent the day working outdoors could find themselves beside someone whose work involved trade. For a few hours, their separate routines overlapped. This was one of the quiet pleasures of such gathering places. The tavern did not need to offer luxury. It offered company. It offered warmth. It offered a meal. And it offered a temporary escape from the loneliness of the road or the repetition of daily work. Beyond the doorway, the night had grown darker. The town was now almost completely illuminated by small flames. The stars were bright above the rooftops. Occasionally, a cool breeze entered the tavern and moved through the room. The lamps responded immediately, their flames leaning to one side before returning upright. Shadows moved across the walls. For a brief moment, the entire room seemed to breathe with the movement of the air. Then everything became still again. The people continued their conversations. Someone poured another cup. Someone tore another piece of bread. Someone leaned back against a cushion and listened. There was something deeply ordinary about the scene. And that ordinary quality was precisely what made it valuable for understanding the ancient past. Most people in ancient Persia did not spend their evenings inside palaces. They lived within the rhythm of work, food, family, travel, trade, and rest. Their nights were shaped by the same simple needs that had shaped human evenings for thousands of years. When darkness came, people gathered where there was light. When they became hungry, they ate. When they became tired, they rested. When they had news to share, they talked. And when the day was finally over, they stayed together for a little while longer before returning home. The Persian Tavern was one small expression of that timeless rhythm. As the lamps continued to burn, the room slowly became more comfortable. The first impression of the tavern was no longer simply one of warmth and light. It was a feeling of stillness. The outside world seemed distant. The long day seemed finished. And beneath the quiet glow of oil lamps, the evening had settled into its peaceful rhythm. Finding a place to rest. As the evening continued, the Persian Tavern settled into a slower and quieter rhythm. The first movement of the night had passed. Those who had come only for a quick meal had already been served, while others remained around the low tables, allowing the evening to unfold without hurry. The oil lamps continued to burn. Their small flames moved gently above the tables, producing a warm, uneven light. Some areas of the room were bright enough to reveal faces, clay cups, bread, and bowls of food. Other corners remained softly hidden in shadow. The darkness outside made the interior seem even warmer. Beyond the open entrance, the ancient town had almost disappeared into the night. Only an occasional figure passed along the street. Sometimes the sound of footsteps approached, became louder for a few moments, and then gradually faded away. Inside, the atmosphere remained peaceful. There were no elaborate decorations to demand attention. Instead, the eye naturally settled upon simple things. A clay vessel resting beside a lamp. A woven cushion lying against a wall. A wooden table marked by years of use. A bowl containing dates. A small dish of herbs. A loaf of bread waiting to be broken. These were ordinary objects, but together they created the familiar surroundings of an evening gathering place. The seating was simple. People could sit around low tables, sometimes upon cushions or woven mats. Such arrangements allowed an evening meal to become something longer than simply eating. Food could remain on the table while conversation continued, cups could be refilled, and people could remain together without needing to stand or move about. This was especially comfortable after a long day. The ancient Persian day could be demanding. There were fields to tend, animals to care for, goods to transport, workshops to operate, markets to manage, and roads to travel. Even those whose work was less physical had spent hours beneath a climate that could be intensely warm during the day. By evening, rest had real value. The tavern provided a place where that rest could begin. A few customers leaned comfortably against cushions. Others sat upright around their tables. Some listened to conversations without contributing. Others spoke freely, knowing that the people around them had come for much the same reason. The sounds remained low. There was the quiet scrape of pottery against wood. The soft tearing of bread. The occasional pouring of a drink. A cough. A laugh. A few words spoken across a table. Then the gentle return of silence between conversations. Nothing was rushed. The night had plenty of time. At one table, travelers spoke about the road behind them. Travel in the Persian world could take people across remarkable distances. The empire connected regions with different landscapes, languages, traditions, and climates. Roads carried merchants, officials, messengers, soldiers, and ordinary travelers from one settlement to another. For someone arriving from far away, a tavern could offer more than food. It could provide a temporary sense of belonging. A traveler who had spent days surrounded by roads and unfamiliar landscapes could suddenly find themselves among voices, smells, and routines that felt reassuringly human. The conversation of others could replace the silence of the road. The warmth of the room could replace the coldness of the night. A simple meal could feel especially comforting after hours of travel. The tavern also offered information. People who traveled regularly carried knowledge with them. They knew which roads were busy. They knew where water could be found. They knew which settlements were prosperous and which were quieter. They heard news from merchants and caravan travelers. Such information could pass casually from one table to another. A question might be asked. An answer might follow. Another person might add something they had heard. Soon a small conversation could become a collection of stories about places many people in the room had never seen. Babylon might be mentioned. Susa might enter the conversation. Persepolis might be spoken of with curiosity. Other cities and regions might be remembered through the experiences of travelers. Yet the tavern was not entirely concerned with distant places. Much of the conversation probably remained wonderfully ordinary. Someone might complain about the day's heat. Another might discuss the price of grain. Someone might mention a difficult customer at the market. Another might talk about an animal that had escaped. These small subjects were part of life. They made the evening feel familiar. The lamps continued to flicker. Their light reflected faintly from the surfaces of the clay vessels. As the night became deeper, the room grew slightly quieter. The earlier arrivals had settled comfortably. The later arrivals had found places. The meal was gradually becoming less important than the company. This was often how an evening gathering changed. At first, people came because they were hungry. Then they stayed because they were comfortable. Conversation extended the meal. Conversation became companionship. And companionship allowed the night to pass gently. Outside, the temperature continued to fall. The breeze moved through the doorway and across the room. For a moment, one of the lamps flickered strongly. A shadow moved across the wall. Then the flame steadied. The room returned to its familiar glow. Beyond the tavern, the town was almost silent. The houses were dark. The marketplace was empty. The streets were quiet beneath the stars. But this small room still contained a little world of its own. Warm light. Food. Drink. Conversation. Rest. Nothing spectacular was happening. And that was exactly the point. An ordinary evening could be peaceful precisely because nothing extraordinary was required. There were no great decisions to make. No journey needed to begin immediately. No work needed to be completed before sunrise. For a few hours, the people inside could simply sit together. The ancient Persian night stretched patiently around them. The lamps burned lower. The voices softened. The last dishes were gradually cleared from some tables. A few customers began preparing to leave. Others remained where they were. The tavern would eventually close for the night, but there was still time before that happened. For now, the room remained warm and quiet. The soft glow of the lamps rested upon the walls. The scent of bread and herbs lingered in the air. And the gentle murmur of conversation continued beneath the vast darkness outside. It was a small moment in the enormous history of Persia. No royal inscription would record it. No monument would preserve it. Yet evenings like this were part of the lived experience of the ancient world. People needed places to rest. They needed food. They needed companionship. And beneath the flickering light of simple oil lamps, they found all three. The tavern remained awake a little longer, holding its quiet circle of warmth against the ancient night. The first cup. Being served. By now, the Persian tavern had settled fully into the evening. The last light of sunset had disappeared hours ago, and the town beyond the doorway was wrapped in darkness. Only the stars and a scattering of oil lamps gave any light to the streets outside. Inside, however, the tavern remained warm and softly illuminated. The small lamps continued to burn above the tables, their flames moving gently in the quiet air. Shadows stretched across the walls and then slowly changed whenever someone passed nearby. The evening meal had begun. Bread was being placed upon tables. Small dishes were being carried through the room. Clay cups and bowls were arranged beside the food. The smell of freshly prepared dishes filled the air, mingling with the scent of herbs, fruit, smoke, and warm pottery. Among the most noticeable objects were the drinking vessels. Some were simple clay cups. Others were more carefully made, shaped by skilled hands and decorated according to the fashions of their region. A cup might be plain and practical, intended for ordinary use. Another might have a more elegant shape, reflecting the wealth or taste of its owner. Yet whatever its appearance, the cup served the same simple purpose. It held the drink that accompanied the evening. Wine had a long history across the ancient Near East, including the lands ruled by the Persian kings. Grapes were cultivated in suitable regions, and wine could be produced, stored, transported, and served in many different settings. It was not necessarily consumed in the same manner everywhere. Water was an essential part of daily life, and wine could be mixed with water in ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern drinking traditions. The strength and character of a drink could therefore vary depending upon how it had been prepared and served. Inside the tavern, a vessel was lifted carefully. Liquid moved slowly into a clay cup. The sound was quiet. A little splash. Then silence. The cup was placed upon the table. The surface of the drink caught the light from a nearby lamp. For a moment, the flame seemed to float within the dark red or amber surface. The first cup of an evening was not necessarily dramatic. It was simply part of the meal. Yet the act of drinking had its own rhythm. Food was eaten slowly. Conversation continued. The cup remained nearby. Someone might take a small sip while listening to another person's story. Another might drink between pieces of bread. A traveler might sit quietly for a moment, enjoying the warmth of the room after the coolness of the night outside. There was no need for constant movement. The tavern encouraged people to remain. The drink was one part of a much larger experience. The clay cup itself was an object that connected the evening to the wider world of ancient craftsmanship. Before it reached the tavern, it had passed through many stages. Clay had been gathered from the earth. It had been shaped by hand or upon a wheel. It had been dried and fired. Perhaps it had been painted or decorated. Then it had entered the world of trade, household use, or hospitality. By the time it rested upon a tavern table, its journey had become invisible. It was simply a cup. But in its quiet simplicity, it represented the practical skills that supported everyday Persian life. Around the room, similar objects could be seen everywhere. Large jars stood against walls. Smaller vessels rested upon tables. Bowls held food. Cups held drinks. The entire evening depended upon these simple containers. Even the oil lamps were vessels of a kind, holding the oil that allowed the room to remain illuminated after sunset. The tavern therefore existed within a world shaped by clay, wood, woven fibers, stone, and metal. There was little of the artificial brightness familiar to modern eyes. Light came from flame. Food came from fields, gardens, animals, and orchards. Drink came from water, fruit, and careful preparation. The evening was built from materials gathered directly from the surrounding world. This made the atmosphere different from a modern restaurant or tavern. The darkness outside was real. The warmth inside was created by fire and human presence. The light was small enough that people naturally gathered close to it. Conversation remained within the circle of illumination. Beyond that circle were shadows. The first cup therefore belonged not only to the meal, but also to the atmosphere of the room. It gave people another reason to remain seated. Another reason to pause. Another small comfort after the day's work. The people around the table slowly became more relaxed. The day's urgency had disappeared. Merchants no longer needed to count their goods. Workers no longer needed to complete their tasks. Travelers no longer needed to watch the road. For the moment, the tavern was enough. A cup was lifted. A sip was taken. Then the cup returned to the table. The conversation continued. Some spoke about places they had visited. Others talked about local matters. There might have been stories about caravans, markets, harvests, animals, family, weather, or the changing condition of roads. The subjects were ordinary. Yet ordinary subjects could occupy an entire evening. A person's life was built from such details. The great Persian Empire might have been governed from magnificent royal centers, but its daily existence depended upon countless ordinary moments like this one. A meal. A cup. A conversation. A lamp burning after sunset. These quiet details rarely appeared in royal inscriptions, but they were part of the lived reality of the people who inhabited the empire. As the evening deepened, the first cups were gradually emptied. Some were refilled. Others remained untouched for a while. The tavern keeper continued moving quietly between the tables, attending to the needs of the customers. The lamps burned steadily overhead. Their light reflected from the clay vessels and disappeared into the darkness beyond the doorway. Outside, the town had become almost completely still. Inside, the soft murmur of voices remained. The first cup had marked the beginning of a slower part of the evening. The meal would continue. The conversations would continue. And for those gathered beneath the warm glow of the lamps, there was no need to think yet about the coming morning. The night was young. The road could wait. The marketplace could wait. Tomorrow could wait. For now, there was only the quiet tavern, the simple meal, the warm light, and the first gentle taste of an evening in ancient Persia. Settling into the evening. The first cup was only the beginning of the evening. As the hours passed, the Persian tavern became increasingly settled, its earlier movements giving way to the comfortable stillness of a gathering that had found its rhythm. Outside, the ancient town had almost disappeared beneath the darkness. Inside, the lamps continued to burn, creating a small world of warmth against the cool night. The evening meal remained spread across the low tables. Bread rested in small piles. Dates and other dried fruits occupied shallow dishes. Herbs and simple foods were placed within easy reach. Clay vessels stood beside the food, some holding water and others containing drinks. Nothing was arranged with the elaborate precision of a royal banquet. This was an ordinary gathering place, and the food reflected that simplicity. Yet simplicity did not mean discomfort. For people who had spent the day working, traveling, trading, carrying goods, tending animals, or managing households, a warm meal in a quiet room could be deeply satisfying. The tavern provided a pause between one day and the next. The day had been full of obligations. The night offered time. That difference could be felt throughout the room. People spoke more slowly. Their movements became less hurried. The voices that had been louder earlier in the evening gradually settled into a gentle murmur. Every so often, a brief burst of laughter rose above the conversations. Then it faded. The lamps continued their quiet work. Their flames moved slightly whenever air entered through the doorway, casting shifting shadows across the plastered walls. The shadows made the room seem almost alive. A person's hand might pass through the light and briefly become enormous upon the wall. A cup might create a dark outline. A moving flame could make an entire corner seem to breathe. Such small changes were part of an evening in a world illuminated almost entirely by fire. There was no constant brightness. There was no expectation that every corner of a room should be visible. The darkness was simply part of the environment. People sat within the light and allowed the surrounding shadows to remain. This gave the tavern a particular atmosphere. The center of the room felt intimate. The edges felt distant. The doorway connected the warm interior to the vast night outside. From time to time, the breeze entered through it, bringing the scent of cool earth. It was possible to hear the distant sounds of the town. Perhaps a dog barked somewhere far away. Perhaps a late traveler crossed a nearby street. Perhaps an animal shifted in a courtyard. Each sound appeared briefly and then disappeared. Inside, the conversations continued. A merchant might describe something that had happened earlier that day. A traveler might speak about a settlement farther along the road. A craftsman might complain about the difficulty of finding good material. Someone else might simply listen. The subjects were not necessarily important. They did not need to be. Conversation in a tavern was often part of the pleasure of being there. The drink on the table encouraged people to remain. The food gave them a reason to sit. The company made the evening longer. A person could arrive intending to eat quickly and leave, only to remain because someone nearby had begun telling an interesting story. This was one of the quiet social functions of such places. They brought people together who might otherwise never have spoken. A traveler arriving from another region could encounter local people. A merchant could meet another trader. Workers could sit together after their day's labor. Information could move naturally between them. In an enormous empire, where roads connected distant regions, such informal gatherings helped news travel. A traveler might mention conditions on the road. Someone might speak of a caravan arriving from another direction. Another person might have heard about prices in a distant market. A small piece of information could pass from one table to another. Yet there was also something restful about simply listening. Not every conversation required participation. Some people could sit quietly, drinking slowly and allowing the voices around them to become background sound. The tavern was suitable for this too. It was not completely silent, but neither was it overwhelmingly loud. The different voices blended together. Individual words became difficult to distinguish from a distance. The result was a continuous human murmur. For a listener, it could become almost soothing. The rhythm was irregular but gentle. A voice rose. Another answered. Someone laughed. A cup touched the table. Then everything settled again. The first drink of the evening also changed the pace of the meal. A cup might be lifted every few minutes. A small sip. A pause. Another bite of bread. Another conversation. Nothing needed to happen quickly. This was especially true after sunset, when there was little reason to hurry unless a journey or household responsibility required it. For many people, the night was a natural period of rest. Artificial light was limited and costly. The darkness itself encouraged people to remain close to home or within places where lamps were available. A tavern therefore became especially noticeable after sunset. Its light could be seen from the street. Its warmth could be felt near the entrance. Its sounds could attract people who had finished their work. Inside, the evening continued. The drink was not the only source of comfort. The room itself was comforting. The walls protected the customers from the night air. The lamps provided warmth as well as light. The food satisfied hunger. The presence of other people reduced the loneliness that could accompany travel or a long working day. All of these small comforts came together. The ancient world was not without leisure. It simply expressed leisure differently. There were meals that lasted longer than necessary. There were conversations that continued long after the important subjects had been discussed. There were stories told simply because people enjoyed hearing them. There was music. There was laughter. There was the pleasure of sitting somewhere warm while darkness covered the streets outside. The Persian Tavern belonged to this wider human tradition. The people gathered there did not need to be famous. They did not need to be wealthy. They only needed an evening with enough time to sit together. As the night progressed, the meal slowly changed. Some dishes became empty. Bread became smaller in quantity. Dates disappeared one by one. The surfaces of the tables became clearer. Empty clay vessels were gathered and replaced. The movement of the servers became slower. Even the lamps seemed quieter. Their flames had burned steadily for hours. Occasionally, an attendant might check the oil and adjust a wick so that the light remained steady. Without such attention, the flame could become weak or smoky. With a small adjustment, it brightened again. That tiny act was part of the evening's rhythm. Light required care. Food required preparation. Water required carrying. Everything that made the tavern comfortable depended upon ordinary human effort. None of it happened automatically. The quietness of the room therefore rested upon a great deal of invisible work. Someone had prepared the food. Someone had baked the bread. Someone had transported the ingredients. Someone had cleaned the vessels. Someone had prepared the lamps. Someone had maintained the building. And now, after all that effort, people could simply sit. This was perhaps the most peaceful part of the evening. The work had been done. For a while, nothing more was required. The tavern seemed to exist outside the normal rhythm of obligation. The people inside could allow themselves to become tired. They could lean against cushions. They could speak softly. They could drink slowly. They could listen to stories without needing to remember every detail. Outside, the stars continued moving across the dark sky. The ancient Persian town remained quiet beneath them. The walls and rooftops absorbed the coolness of the night. Courtyards became silent. Animals rested. Families slept. Yet the tavern remained awake a little longer. Its doorway still glowed. Its lamps still flickered. Its table still held small gatherings. The first cup had become part of a much longer evening. The drink itself was almost secondary now. What mattered was the atmosphere that surrounded it. Warmth. Food. Light. Conversation. Rest. These simple things had brought people together. And beneath the ancient Persian night, they continued to share the quiet hours before sleep. Gradually, the voices became softer. The laughter became less frequent. The movements around the room slowed. One person finished a drink. Another folded a piece of cloth. Someone leaned back and closed their eyes for a moment. The tavern was beginning to feel drowsy. Even the conversation seemed to drift more gently than before. The night had become deep. And for a little while longer, beneath the steady glow of the oil lamps, the ancient Persian tavern remained a warm and peaceful shelter from the darkness beyond its doorway. Food on the table. Bread, dates, herbs, and simple dishes. The evening had now settled deeply over the Persian town, and inside the tavern, the attention of the room slowly turned toward food. The first cups had already been served. Conversation had become easier. The lamps were burning steadily. And across the low tables, simple dishes were beginning to form the center of the evening. There was nothing hurried about the meal. In an ancient tavern, food was not necessarily presented as a succession of carefully arranged courses. Much of it could be placed within reach, allowing people to eat gradually while continuing their conversations. Bread was among the most important foods. A loaf rested upon one of the tables, still carrying the warmth of the day's baking. Its surface was slightly browned from the heat, while the inside remained soft enough to tear apart easily. Bread was not simply something placed beside a meal. It was one of the foundations of everyday life. Across ancient Persia and the wider Near Eastern world, grains were essential to survival. Wheat and barley could be transformed into various forms of bread and other foods, depending upon the region, resources, and customs of the household. The bread served in an ordinary tavern would not have needed to be elaborate. It only needed to be fresh enough, filling enough, and plentiful enough to accompany the evening meal. Pieces were broken away by hand. A section might be dipped into a dish. Another piece might be used to gather herbs or other foods. The simple act of breaking bread made the meal feel communal. Nearby were small dishes of dried fruit. Dates were especially valuable in the ancient Near East, where date palms flourished in suitable warm regions. Their sweetness provided a pleasant contrast to bread and savory foods. Dried fruits also had the advantage of keeping for long periods, making them useful for travelers and households alike. A small bowl could contain several dates, their surfaces slightly wrinkled from drying. They required no elaborate preparation. They could simply be picked up and eaten. Other fruits might also appear depending upon the season and the region. Grapes were important in many parts of the ancient Persian world, both as fresh fruit and as a source of wine. Figs could be dried and stored. Other fruits might be preserved or consumed when available. The tavern therefore offered food according to the practical rhythms of agriculture and trade. What appeared on the table depended partly upon what had been grown nearby, what had been preserved from earlier seasons, and what merchants had brought from elsewhere. Herbs added another layer of flavor. Their scent could fill the room even before they were eaten. Some were used in cooking. Others could be served alongside bread or incorporated into simple dishes. The ancient Persian world contained an enormous variety of landscapes, from fertile plains to mountains and dry regions, and each environment contributed different ingredients to the food supply. Trade connected these regions. A tavern located along an important route could therefore have access to foods that were not necessarily grown immediately outside the town. This was one of the quiet effects of living within a large interconnected empire. A meal could contain ingredients that had traveled farther than the people eating them realized. The same roads that carried merchants, officials, and travelers also carried food. Grain moved between regions. Fruit could be transported. Spices and herbs could travel with merchants. Wine and other liquids could be stored in containers and carried over considerable distances. By the time such products reached a tavern table, their journey had become invisible. They simply became part of dinner. Among the dishes were likely to be foods that required little ceremony. Vegetables could be cooked until soft. Legumes could provide a filling source of nourishment. Cheese and other dairy foods could accompany bread. Meat might appear when available and affordable, though it would not necessarily be the central feature of every ordinary meal. The ancient diet was shaped by availability, wealth, season, and geography. A wealthy household could enjoy a greater variety than a poor household. A traveler with money could order more than someone with very little. A town near fertile agricultural land could have different foods from one located in a dry region. The tavern reflected these differences. It was not a single standardized experience. Every evening meal depended upon the people present and the supplies available. Still, certain elements would have felt familiar. Bread, water, fruit, herbs, simple cooked foods. These were the comfortable foundations of an evening meal. The room itself added to the experience. The scent of warm bread mingled with the smoke from oil lamps. The sweetness of dates remained in the air. Herbs released their fragrance whenever they were moved. The clay vessels absorbed some of the warmth from the room. Every smell seemed connected to something physical and familiar. There were no artificial fragrances. No unnecessary decoration. The tavern smelled like food, fire, pottery, and people. For those sitting inside, this was the smell of the evening. The low tables encouraged the food to be shared. A dish could be placed in the center. Several people could reach toward it. Bread could pass from one person to another. The meal became a social activity rather than something performed separately by each individual. This was particularly important in a place where strangers might sit together. Food provided an easy beginning to conversation. A person could offer bread. Someone could comment on a dish. A traveler could ask about an unfamiliar ingredient. A local might explain where something had come from. Small interactions could naturally become longer conversations. At another table, someone might eat quietly. Not every person in the tavern would have been interested in talking. Some might have been tired after a long journey. Others might simply have preferred listening. The atmosphere allowed both. The tavern did not require constant entertainment. A person could eat slowly while listening to the voices around them. The gentle noise of the room could become almost soothing. The clink of pottery. The tearing of bread. The quiet movement of people. The occasional laugh. The soft crackle of a lamp. Together, these sounds formed the natural music of the evening. Outside, the streets remained dark. The town had almost completely surrendered itself to sleep. Inside, the meal continued. The lamps illuminated the tables. The food slowly disappeared. And the warmth of the room made the cool night outside seem even farther away. For a moment, the entire world could appear to have narrowed to the small circle of light surrounding the tables. There was no need to think about the great distances of the Persian Empire. No need to imagine the royal road stretching toward distant cities. No need to think about kings, armies, taxes, or political affairs. The evening was much smaller than that. It was a piece of bread, a sweet date, a little herb, a warm dish, a quiet cup, a conversation between neighbors. This was the ordinary side of ancient life, and it was perhaps the side most people experience most often. The great events of history were rare. Meals were not. People had to eat every day. They had to gather together. They had to rest. And in places like this modest tavern, those basic needs became part of a peaceful evening. The bread became smaller. The dishes became emptier. The scent of food remained. And as the night continued, the simple meal slowly became something more than nourishment. It became part of the atmosphere, part of the companionship, part of the quiet rhythm of the ancient Persian night. The lamps continued to glow above the tables. The stars continued to shine beyond the doorway. And within the warm tavern, the evening meal carried gently onward. Eating slowly, the meal continued at an unhurried pace as the ancient Persian tavern settled more deeply into the quiet hours of the night. There was no great rush to finish. The day's work had already ended, and the darkness outside had removed much of the pressure that belonged to daylight. The market was closed, the roads were becoming quiet, and the people gathered inside the tavern had nowhere that demanded their immediate attention. The food remained upon the low tables. Bread was still being broken into smaller pieces. Dates rested in shallow bowls. Herbs and vegetables gave color to the otherwise simple meal. Clay vessels stood among the dishes, their surfaces catching the warm glow of the lamps. The meal was modest, but it was not without variety. Ancient Persian food traditions were shaped by an enormous landscape. The lands under Persian rule stretched across regions with different climates and agricultural practices. Some areas were fertile and well watered, while others depended upon careful irrigation and seasonal rainfall. What appeared on a tavern table therefore depended greatly upon location. Near productive agricultural regions, grains could form an important part of daily food. In warmer areas, dates and other fruits were familiar. In places where livestock were raised, dairy products and meat could become part of the diet. Herbs, onions, garlic, legumes, and vegetables could provide flavor and nourishment. The meal did not need to be elaborate to be satisfying. Bread alone could be filling. A handful of dates could provide sweetness. A simple vegetable dish could add warmth and flavor. A little cheese or another preserved food could complete the table. Such foods were practical because they could be stored, transported, prepared, and shared. The tavern's meal reflected this practical character. People ate gradually. A piece of bread was broken. A little food was taken. A sip of drink followed. Then conversation resumed. The pattern repeated. There was something almost rhythmic about it. Food. Conversation. Silence. Drink. Another story. Another piece of bread. The oil lamps continued to flicker overhead. Their light made the colors of the food appear softer than they would have looked beneath daylight. The warm glow rested upon the surface of the bread. It touched the edges of clay bowls. It reflected from the liquid inside the cups. Beyond the circle of light, the walls disappeared into shadow. The darkness made the small room feel intimate. Those sitting around the tables were close enough to hear one another without raising their voices. The tavern was not simply a place where people consumed food. It was a place where people spent time. This distinction mattered. A meal could be finished quickly, but an evening meal could last much longer. The food provided a reason to remain. Conversation gave the evening its length. One story could lead to another. One subject could lead to a memory. A traveler might describe a distant town. A merchant might remember an earlier journey. Someone from the local area might offer advice about the roads. The food continued to disappear while the stories continued to grow. Sometimes the conversation would become animated. A voice might rise. Several people might laugh. Then the room would settle again. At another table, people might speak more quietly. Some customers might simply listen to the general murmur. This mixture of conversation gave the tavern its particular sound. There was no single voice dominating the room for very long. Instead, many small conversations existed at once. From a distance, they blended into one gentle hum. The occasional clink of pottery broke through. A cup was set down. A bowl was moved. A piece of bread was torn. The sounds were ordinary. Yet after the long day, they could become comforting. For travelers especially, the simple act of sitting down with food could bring a feeling of relief. Travel across ancient Persia was not always easy. Roads could be dusty. Distances could be long. Weather could be demanding. Animals needed care. Water had to be found. Caravans had to move carefully across unfamiliar landscapes. Even a short journey could leave a person tired. A tavern offered a moment of stillness. There was a roof overhead. There was food. There was water. There were people nearby. And there was the reassurance of an established place where travelers could pause before continuing their journey. For local residents, the experience was different but equally familiar. The tavern could be an extension of the social life of the town. Neighbors might meet there. Merchants might exchange news. Workers might relax together. The boundaries between eating and socializing were naturally blurred. Food brought people together. The meal was shared through conversation as much as through dishes. Bread was particularly suited to this kind of eating. It could be broken into portions without requiring utensils. A loaf could sit at the center of a table. People could take what they needed. Dates could be passed easily. Herbs could be added to other foods. The simplicity of the meal made it flexible. Nothing needed to be measured precisely. Nothing needed to be arranged according to complicated rules. People could simply eat. The same simplicity applied to the drink. A cup could be lifted while someone was speaking. It could be set down while listening. Another could be poured later. The evening moved according to the pace of the people rather than the demands of a formal schedule. Outside, the night continued to deepen. The stars were now bright above the town. The temperature had fallen. A cool breeze moved through the narrow streets. It entered the tavern occasionally, bringing a moment of freshness. The flames responded by bending slightly. Then they straightened again. The room remained warm. The smell of food lingered. The scent of bread had become softer now that much of it had been eaten. The dishes were gradually becoming empty. Some tables had only a few pieces of fruit remaining. Others still held bread and small dishes. The evening was slowly consuming the meal just as the night was consuming the last traces of activity in the town. At some point, someone might pause and simply look around. The room would appear almost unchanged. The same lamps. The same low tables. The same walls. The same gentle voices. Yet the feeling would be different. Earlier, the evening had been beginning. Now it had become established. People were comfortable. The day's tension had faded. The food had satisfied hunger. The drink had accompanied conversation. The warmth of the room had made the darkness outside feel distant. This was the quiet middle of the night. Nothing spectacular was happening. And that was precisely why it could be so peaceful. Ancient life is often imagined through monuments and battles, kings and temples, grand processions, and distant empires. But most lives were made of smaller moments. A person waking in the morning, working through the day, eating when hungry, talking with others, resting when tired, watching the sun disappear, sitting beneath an oil lamp after darkness arrived. These ordinary experiences were repeated countless times across generations. A tavern evening belonged to that larger rhythm. The people inside did not know that centuries later, historians would try to reconstruct their world from pottery fragments, texts, paintings, buildings, and archaeological remains. They were simply living, eating, talking, resting. Perhaps tomorrow would bring another busy day. Perhaps a journey would continue. Perhaps the marketplace would become noisy again. But tonight there was still time. The bread could be finished slowly. The last dates could be shared. The cups could remain upon the tables. The conversations could continue. And the lamps could keep burning. As the hours passed, the meal became quieter. People ate less. They spoke more softly. Some leaned comfortably against cushions. Others rested their hands beside their cups. A few empty dishes were gradually collected. The tavern began to feel less like a place of dining and more like a room for quiet companionship. The food had done what it needed to do. It had nourished the people gathered there. Now the evening could continue without it. Outside, the ancient Persian town slept beneath a sky filled with stars. Inside, the tavern remained warm and gently illuminated. The last pieces of bread waited upon a few tables. A handful of dates remained. The herbs had released their fragrance into the air, and the soft sounds of conversation continued beneath the flickering lamps. Slowly, the night carried the tavern toward the next part of the evening. The meal was nearly finished. But the stories, conversations, and quiet companionship had only just begun. The people of the tavern. Travelers and merchants. As the meal slowly came to an end, attention inside the Persian tavern naturally shifted toward the people gathered around its tables. The food had brought everyone into the same room, but conversation was what allowed the evening to continue. Under the warm glow of the oil lamps, different kinds of lives briefly existed side by side. A merchant might sit beside a traveler. A craftsman might share a table with a local shopkeeper. Someone who had spent the day working in the fields could find themselves listening to someone who had arrived from a distant town. The tavern was small, but the world beyond its doorway was enormous. The Persian Empire stretched across an extraordinary variety of landscapes and communities. Roads connected cities, agricultural regions, military centers, estates, and trading settlements. People traveled for many reasons, and the movement of people meant that news, languages, goods, stories, and customs could move with them. A tavern offered one of the simplest places for these different worlds to meet. Among the customers were merchants. Their lives were closely connected to roads and markets. They might have traveled with animals carrying textiles, grain, metal goods, pottery, spices, wine, or other valuable products. Some journeys could last many days or even longer, depending upon the distance and conditions. For a merchant, the road was both workplace and uncertainty. Every journey required planning. Animals needed food and water. Goods needed protection. Routes needed to be understood. Places to rest had to be known. Weather could affect travel. The condition of roads could change. A merchant therefore carried more than physical goods. A merchant also carried information. At the tavern table, that information could become conversation. One person might ask where the merchant had come from. Another might ask whether the road had been difficult. Someone might want to know whether a particular market was busy. A traveler could mention the condition of a bridge or road farther away. Another could respond with information about a different route. Such exchanges did not need to be formal. They could happen naturally while eating. A cup could be lifted. A question could be asked. An answer could lead to another question. Soon the table would be discussing places many of them had never visited. The great cities of the Persian world could become subjects of conversation. Babylon, with its ancient history and immense urban landscape, might be remembered. Susa, an important center of Persian royal power, could appear in stories. Persepolis, the magnificent ceremonial center of the Achaemenid kings, might be mentioned by someone who had traveled through the region or heard reports from others. But the conversations did not need to remain focused on famous cities. Much of the information that mattered to ordinary travelers concerned smaller places. A village where water was plentiful. A settlement where animals could rest. A road that became difficult after heavy rain. A market where certain goods could be found. A household or inn known for hospitality. These details could be far more useful to someone on the road than stories about distant palaces. The tavern therefore became a small meeting point for practical knowledge. A traveler arriving late could listen quietly and learn something valuable without intending to. The road beyond the town might be unfamiliar, but the voices inside the tavern could make it seem less uncertain. Travelers also carried stories. Some stories concerned places. Others concerned people. A merchant might describe a strange custom observed in another region. A traveler might remember an unusually beautiful landscape. Someone could speak of a mountain pass, a river crossing, or a busy caravan road. Perhaps there had been a difficult journey through dry country. Perhaps a caravan had been delayed. Perhaps the road had been unexpectedly peaceful. These stories gave the listeners a sense of the wider world beyond their own town. For people who rarely traveled, such conversations could be a form of imagined travel. A distant landscape could become real through description. A city never visited could be pictured through the words of someone who had seen it. The tavern therefore connected not only people, but places. One conversation could stretch across hundreds of miles. Yet the atmosphere remained relaxed. The stories were not delivered like official reports. They were simply part of the evening. Someone might exaggerate. Someone else might disagree. Another might laugh and say that the story had been told differently before. The listeners would decide for themselves what seemed believable. This was the informal world of conversation. Not everything needed to be recorded. Not everything needed to be proven. Stories could simply be enjoyed. The merchants themselves would have brought visual evidence of their journeys. Their clothing might carry traces of travel. Their animals might be tired. Their goods might be packed carefully. Their speech could contain words and expressions familiar in distant places. Persia was a multilingual and multicultural empire, and travelers could encounter people with very different backgrounds. Languages and dialects varied across the vast territories under Persian rule. A tavern could therefore contain voices that did not all sound alike. Some conversations might require translation. Others might rely on gestures and familiar expressions. Trade encouraged people to develop practical ways of communicating across linguistic boundaries. The ability to understand others was useful on the road. The merchant world depended upon it. And the tavern provided a small, peaceful setting in which such differences became less important. Food could be shared even when languages differed. A cup could be offered without explanation. A smile could communicate hospitality. A gesture toward an empty place could invite someone to sit. The simplest forms of human interaction needed no complicated translation. The room gradually became more comfortable as the evening continued. The merchants relaxed. Travelers leaned back against cushions. Some people removed dusty outer garments or loosened clothing after the day's heat. The road seemed farther away now. For those who had spent hours traveling, this was perhaps the most valuable part of the evening. The body could rest. The feet could stop. The mind could stop watching the road. The lamps provided a steady source of light. The food had taken away hunger. The conversation provided company. The tavern offered a brief sense of safety. It was not necessarily luxurious. It did not need to be. A roof, a meal, a drink, and a place to sit could be enough. Beyond the walls, the night was becoming colder. The road was dark. Traveling after sunset was more difficult and could be dangerous depending upon the location and circumstances. Remaining inside therefore made practical sense. The tavern allowed travelers to wait until morning. Some might have planned to continue at first light. Others might stay longer if circumstances required it. The room could accommodate both. The evening was flexible. There was no need for everyone to leave at the same moment. Some people would remain until the lamps burned low. Others would depart earlier. The tavern keeper would have known this rhythm. The quiet arrival of travelers. The steady serving of food. The gradual decline of conversation. The final cups. The closing of the door. Then another morning. This pattern might have repeated many times. The tavern was therefore part of the town's regular rhythm. It was not an extraordinary institution. Its importance came from repetition. Night after night, people gathered. Night after night, travelers arrived. News passed from mouth to mouth. Goods moved along the roads. Stories crossed regions. And ordinary people spent a few hours together beneath the warm light of oil lamps. The Persian Empire might have been vast, but inside the tavern the world became small enough to share a table. A merchant from one region. A traveler from another. A local resident. A craftsman. A worker. Different lives. Different journeys. One quiet room. The conversations continued as the lamps burned steadily above them. Outside, the stars remained bright over the ancient town. And within the tavern, the wider Persian world seemed to arrive quietly through the voices of those who had traveled across it. Ordinary people. The merchants and travelers were only one part of the evening. Around the other tables sat people whose lives were tied more closely to the town itself. They had not necessarily crossed distant roads or carried goods between cities. Their journeys might have been measured in streets rather than provinces, in familiar paths rather than long caravan routes. Yet their lives were no less important to the atmosphere of the tavern. There were workers who had finished their day's labor. There were craftsmen whose hands still carried traces of the materials they had worked with. There were shopkeepers who had spent the daylight hours serving customers. There were messengers, porters, servants, and local residents who had simply come to share food and conversation before returning home. The tavern brought these different people together without requiring them to have anything extraordinary in common. They had worked. They had become hungry. The evening had arrived. That was enough. The room therefore represented a quieter side of Persian society. The great Persian Empire was often described through its kings, armies, royal palaces, monumental architecture, and long-distance administration. But beneath that impressive structure lived millions of ordinary people. Their days were filled with practical concerns. Food had to be prepared. Animals had to be fed. Tools had to be repaired. Goods had to be made. Fields had to be cultivated. Water had to be carried. Buildings had to be maintained. Markets had to function. Children had to be cared for. These activities rarely appeared in grand historical records, yet they formed the foundation upon which the larger society depended. The tavern offered a small glimpse into this everyday world. A craftsman might arrive after spending the day shaping wood, metal, leather, or clay. The work could be repetitive and physically demanding. Hands were used constantly. Tools had to be handled carefully. Materials could be expensive or difficult to replace. A mistake could mean wasted time or damaged goods. By evening, such a worker might have little interest in complicated entertainment. A meal and a quiet place to sit could be enough. The tavern provided both. Another customer might have worked outdoors. The heat of the Persian day could be intense, particularly during the warmer months. Fields, roads, workshops, and construction sites exposed workers to the sun for long periods. The coolness of the evening would therefore have been welcome. Inside the tavern, the air was calmer. The walls offered shade. The lamps provided warmth without the harshness of daylight. A simple meal could feel particularly satisfying after hours of physical work. The people gathered there did not necessarily discuss important matters. Sometimes conversation was simply a way to pass the evening. Someone might ask about the day's work. Another might complain about the weather. Someone might mention a family matter. Another could speak about an upcoming market. Small pieces of information passed casually from one person to another. This was the ordinary rhythm of community life. A tavern could also be a place where people encountered those outside their immediate circle. A craftsman might know other craftspeople but rarely meet travelers. A local shopkeeper might recognize many customers but not know much about their lives beyond the marketplace. At the tavern, these boundaries could become softer. People sat close together. Food was shared. Conversation moved naturally between tables. The presence of strangers was not necessarily uncomfortable. A newcomer could simply listen for a while. If conversation became interesting, they could join. If not, they could remain quiet. There was room for both. The atmosphere did not demand constant attention. This made the tavern particularly suitable for tired people. A long day could leave the mind as exhausted as the body. After hours of work, there was comfort in hearing other voices without needing to respond to every word. The murmur of conversation became background sound. The soft movement of people became part of the room. The lamps flickered. The food gave off its lingering scent. Outside, the streets remained dark. Together, these details created a peaceful environment. There were also people whose work connected them directly with the movement of goods and services. Porters carried loads. Servants attended to households. Animal handlers cared for donkeys, horses, and other working animals. Messengers traveled between places. Each occupation had its own demands. The tavern could bring them together at the end of the day. Their social position might differ. Their wealth might differ. Their responsibilities might differ. But hunger and tiredness were universal. So was the desire for a moment of rest. This is one reason ordinary taverns appear in so many different societies throughout history. They answer basic human needs. People need somewhere to sit, somewhere to eat, somewhere to speak, somewhere to meet others, and sometimes somewhere to remain for a few hours before returning home. In the Persian world, such places existed within a much broader network of settlements and roads. The empire's administrative organization connected communities across enormous distances. Officials, merchants, soldiers, and travelers moved between regions. But most people spent most of their lives close to home. Their world was often local. They knew their streets. They knew their neighbors. They knew the marketplace. They knew the nearby fields, gardens, workshops, and wells. A tavern could therefore become one of the places where local life was shared. News about the town could appear in conversation. A new merchant might be discussed. A change in prices might be mentioned. A damaged road could become a topic. A festival or local event might be remembered. People did not need written newspapers to know what was happening around them. Information traveled through people. And taverns, markets, workshops, and courtyards all contributed to that flow. The conversations were not always accurate. Rumors could spread. Stories could grow with every retelling. A small event could become much larger by the time it reached another table. But this was part of human communication long before modern media. The tavern was one of many places where people exchanged what they knew or thought they knew. Still, the evening was not dominated by information. There was laughter. There were pauses. There were quiet moments when nobody seemed to have anything important to say. Someone might simply watch the lamp flame. Someone might slowly finish a cup. Someone might rest against a cushion and listen to the voices around them. The atmosphere became increasingly relaxed. The day was now far behind. The night had become the main reality. The stars were bright outside. The streets were nearly empty. The tavern's doorway framed a small portion of the dark town. Beyond it, houses stood quietly beneath the sky. Inside, the last traces of the meal remained upon the tables. The people continued talking. Some conversations became softer. Some customers began preparing to leave. Others remained. There was no need for everyone to follow the same schedule. The evening belonged to each person differently. For some, it was nearly time to return home. For others, there were still stories to hear. For travelers, the tavern might be the safest and most convenient place to remain until morning. For local workers, it might simply be the final stop before sleep. The same room could serve many purposes. And that flexibility was part of its charm. The tavern was not grand enough to separate people by ceremony. It was informal, practical, warm, human. Here, the ordinary people of ancient Persia could simply exist together for a while. Their names would disappear from history. Their individual conversations would never be recorded. Their exact meals would not be remembered. Yet their kind of evening must have been repeated countless times. A lamp was lit. Food was served. People sat together. Stories were exchanged. Cups were lifted. The night deepened. Then eventually, one by one, people went home. For a few peaceful hours, however, the tavern held them together beneath its small circle of light. Outside, ancient Persia slept. Inside, ordinary life continued quietly. Stories, music, and conversation. The evening storyteller. The meal had almost disappeared from the tables by the time the evening conversation began to change. The earlier discussions about work, markets, roads, and daily affairs gradually became quieter. People had eaten enough to settle comfortably, and the tavern no longer carried the busy rhythm of the beginning of the evening. The lamps continued to burn. Their flames were smaller now, but their light remained warm. Across the room, several customers leaned against cushions and listened as another voice began telling a story. Storytelling belonged naturally to evenings like this. Long before printed books, newspapers, radios, or recorded entertainment, people depended upon memory and speech to preserve stories. History, family traditions, legends, moral tales, local memories, and accounts of distant places could all travel from one generation to another through spoken words. A tavern offered a particularly suitable setting. There was already an audience. There was enough light to remain awake. There was food and drink. And most importantly, there was time. The storyteller did not need to hurry. A story could begin slowly. A few listeners might already know its opening. Others might hear it for the first time. The voice moved gently through the room, rising slightly at moments of importance and lowering again during quieter passages. The listeners responded in small ways. Someone smiled. Someone nodded. Someone whispered a comment to a neighbor. Then everyone became quiet again. The subject of the story could have been almost anything. Perhaps it concerned a journey. Perhaps it remembered a distant city. Perhaps it involved a clever merchant, a difficult road, an unusual encounter, or a famous figure from the Persian past. The ancient Persian world possessed a rich tradition of oral storytelling, and stories could carry ideas across communities even when written records were unavailable to ordinary people. Some stories changed with each telling. A detail might be added. Another might disappear. A familiar event might become more dramatic as it was remembered. The teller's own personality could shape the story. This did not necessarily make the story less meaningful. Oral traditions were living things. They changed as people repeated them. Inside the tavern, the storyteller became the center of attention for a while. The other conversations faded. Even those who had been speaking quietly began listening. The sound of the voice seemed to fill the room without needing to become loud. The tavern itself contributed to the atmosphere. The low ceiling helped contain the sound. The lamps created a warm circle of light. The darkness outside made the interior feel separate from the rest of the town. It was almost as though the story existed within its own small world. The listeners did not need to travel anywhere. They could remain seated and allow the words to create distant landscapes in their imagination. A mountain road. A crowded market. A royal city. A caravan moving beneath the sun. A river crossing. A settlement beyond the horizon. The storyteller could make a distant place feel close simply by describing it. This was especially meaningful for people whose lives were mostly local. Not everyone could travel across the Persian Empire. Travel required time, money, animals, supplies, and sometimes official permission. For many ordinary people, the world beyond their town remained something heard about rather than experienced. Stories provided another way of knowing that wider world. A person might never see a royal palace, but could hear someone describe its gates. A person might never travel along a famous road, but could listen to stories about those who had. A person might never meet people from distant lands, but could hear their names and customs discussed. The storyteller therefore became a kind of guide to places beyond the tavern. The story continued. Perhaps there was a moment of humor. Several listeners laughed. The storyteller paused, allowing the laughter to settle. Then the voice resumed. The rhythm was almost musical. Words. Pause. Reaction. Silence. Words again. Such rhythms could hold attention for long periods. The tavern became quieter as the night deepened. The sounds from outside were now rare. Occasionally, footsteps crossed the street. Occasionally, an animal moved somewhere nearby. But most of the town had gone to sleep. The tavern remained one of the few places still awake. Inside, the story continued beneath the lamps. There was something timeless about the scene. People had gathered around a speaker for thousands of years. The technology changed. The buildings changed. The languages changed. But the simple pleasure of listening to a story remained remarkably constant. The storyteller did not need an elaborate stage. The room itself was enough. A voice. An audience. A little light. And time. The people listening could imagine the scenes as they were described. Perhaps some closed their eyes briefly. Perhaps others rested their hands beside their cups. Someone might lean forward when the story became interesting. Another might smile at a familiar part. These small movements revealed how deeply people could become absorbed in spoken stories. The evening did not feel empty. It felt full. Not with noise, but with attention. The story gave shape to the passing hours. It also provided a break from ordinary concerns. For a while, nobody needed to think about tomorrow's work. The merchant did not need to calculate his next transaction. The worker did not need to think about the next day's labor. The traveler did not need to consider the next stage of the road. The story allowed the mind to wander. This was perhaps one of the quiet pleasures of ancient entertainment. There was no need to participate physically. Listening was enough. The words created movement where the body remained still. The mind could travel while the room stayed quiet. This made storytelling especially suited to the later hours of the night. As the story continued, the lamp seemed to burn more softly. The room became increasingly comfortable. The warmth of the evening meal remained. The smell of bread and herbs lingered faintly. The cups on the tables were no longer being moved as frequently. Most people were settled now. The storyteller's voice became almost part of the room itself. At times it seemed to rise from the shadows. At other times it became so soft that listeners had to concentrate to hear every word. The story did not need to be hurried toward an ending. There was no clock demanding that it finish at a particular moment. The night was still long. The audience could remain. The storyteller could continue. And the ancient Persian town outside remained peacefully asleep. Perhaps the story eventually reached its conclusion. The final words were spoken more slowly. A few listeners responded. Someone laughed softly. Another offered a brief comment. Then there was a moment of silence. The room seemed almost still. The storyteller had finished. Yet the feeling created by the story remained. People began speaking again, quietly discussing what they had heard. Someone remembered another version. Someone else mentioned a similar story. A traveler connected it to something seen on the road. The story had ended, but conversation had begun again. That was the nature of an evening like this. One thing led naturally to another. Food led to conversation. Conversation led to stories. Stories led to memories. Memories led to more stories. The hours passed without anyone needing to notice them. Outside, the stars continued their slow movement across the sky. Inside, the tavern remained illuminated. The lamps flickered. The cushions held tired bodies. The tables were scattered with empty vessels. And the voices of ordinary people continued softly beneath the roof. The Persian night had become deep and peaceful. Quiet music in the night. The story had ended, but the evening was not yet ready to end. For a few moments, the tavern remained unusually quiet. The last words of the storyteller seemed to linger in the warm air, while the small oil lamps continued to flicker against the plastered walls. A few people exchanged quiet remarks about the tale, while others simply remained seated, enjoying the peaceful pause that followed. Then, from somewhere near the far side of the room, came the soft sound of music. It was not loud. It did not suddenly transform the tavern into a place of spectacle. Instead, the first notes appeared gently, almost blending with the ordinary sounds of the room. A string was plucked. There was a pause. Another note followed. Then a slow sequence of sounds began to form. Music had a long and important place in the cultures of the ancient Near East, including the Persian world. Instruments could accompany celebrations, ceremonies, royal occasions, religious practices, storytelling, and ordinary social gatherings. In a tavern, however, music could be much simpler. It did not need to impress a royal audience. It only needed to create an atmosphere. The instrument might have been a stringed instrument, perhaps resembling the long-necked lute or other instruments known from ancient Iranian and Near Eastern traditions. Exact instruments varied across periods and regions, but the basic idea was familiar: strings, wood, careful craftsmanship, and the human hand producing sound. The music continued quietly. The notes were separated by small pauses. This made them seem almost like footsteps moving slowly through the darkness. The listeners did not need to speak. For a while, the room simply listened. The lamps flickered. The night air moved gently through the doorway. The music rose and faded. Outside, the town remained almost completely silent. The contrast between the quiet street and the softly musical tavern created a peaceful atmosphere. Someone at a nearby table leaned back against a cushion. Another person rested a hand beside an empty clay cup. A traveler who had spent much of the day on the road remained still, listening. The music did not require attention in the same way that a story did. A story demanded that the listener follow words and remember events. Music could simply exist in the background. It could be heard without being analyzed. It could accompany conversation or silence. It could fill the spaces between words. This made it especially suitable for the later hours of the evening. The melody continued. Sometimes it became slightly brighter. Sometimes it became slower. The musician did not need to maintain a constant rhythm. The performance could respond naturally to the mood of the room. If people became louder, the music might rise. If the tavern became quieter, the music could become softer. There was no need for a strict separation between performer and audience. The music belonged to the gathering. Someone might speak while it played. Another might laugh. A cup might touch a table. The melody would continue beneath everything. This was not a concert in the modern sense. It was part of the evening. Music could also accompany storytelling. In ancient traditions, the boundaries between poetry, music, memory, and oral history were often fluid. Stories and poems could be performed rather than simply read. Rhythm and melody helped words remain memorable. A skilled storyteller or singer could therefore preserve long passages through repetition and musical structure. In the tavern, perhaps a short song followed the earlier story. The words might describe love, travel, friendship, separation, nature, or the hardships of the road. Perhaps the song was familiar to some listeners. Perhaps others had never heard it before. The exact subject mattered less than the atmosphere. The voice would rise gently, then fall. The instrument would follow. The listeners remained quiet. The warm room seemed to become even smaller. The darkness outside seemed even farther away. There was something comforting about hearing music while sitting safely indoors at night. The ancient world could be uncertain. Roads were long. Weather could change suddenly. Travel could be difficult. Illness, accidents, conflict, and hunger were realities that people understood. But moments of peace existed too. A warm room. A shared meal. A cup. A story. A melody. These things could make an evening feel secure. The tavern therefore provided more than food and drink. It provided a temporary shelter from the wider uncertainties of life. The music continued for a while. Perhaps the melody was repeated. Perhaps the musician changed the rhythm. The sound remained gentle. The people listening did not need to applaud after every passage. Sometimes appreciation could be shown simply by continuing to listen. The performer could see the room becoming calmer. That was enough. The lamps burned steadily. One of them began to weaken. The flame became smaller. An attendant approached quietly and adjusted the wick. The light brightened again. The music continued uninterrupted. The scene was simple. No stage. No elaborate decorations. No large audience. Only a small room, a handful of people, and a musician providing a quiet accompaniment to the evening. This simplicity made the moment feel intimate. Music was not separated from ordinary life. It existed alongside food, conversation, travel, work, and rest. A melody could accompany a meal. A song could accompany a journey. An instrument could be played at a celebration. A lullaby could be sung to a child. A tavern musician could help people forget the day's exhaustion for a while. These were different expressions of the same human desire to create sound and meaning. As the night deepened, the music became increasingly slow. The musician seemed to sense that the room was becoming tired. People were no longer speaking as much. Some had already finished their drinks. The remaining conversations were quiet. A few customers appeared ready to leave. Others remained comfortably seated. The music continued. The notes seemed to drift through the room rather than command it. A gentle breeze entered from the doorway. It carried the cool scent of the night. The flame of the nearest lamp trembled. The shadows moved across the wall. Then everything became still again. The melody continued. For a moment, it seemed possible to hear the entire room breathing around it. The soft movement of clothing. The occasional sound of pottery. The distant footsteps of someone outside. The quiet instrument. The faint murmur of conversation. All of these sounds belonged together. None needed to be separated. They formed the soundscape of an ancient evening. Eventually, the musician reached the end of the melody. The final note lasted for a moment, then disappeared. Silence returned. This time, the silence felt different. It was not an empty silence. It was the kind of silence that follows something peaceful. Nobody immediately spoke. The room seemed to rest. The lamps continued burning. Outside, the stars remained bright. Then, gradually, quiet conversation returned. Someone murmured a few words. Another answered. A small laugh appeared at one table. The tavern resumed its ordinary rhythm. But the music had changed the atmosphere. The room now felt slower. The night felt deeper. The people seemed more settled. For those who had traveled far, perhaps the music made the tavern feel a little more like home. For local residents, it may simply have been another pleasant part of the evening. For everyone, it provided a few moments when nothing was required except listening. The ancient Persian night continued beyond the doorway. The roads were dark. The rooftops were quiet. The stars stretched across the sky. And beneath the small roof of the tavern, the last traces of music remained in memory. The story had been told. The melody had been played. The meal was finished. The cups were slowly becoming empty. The evening was moving gently toward its final hours. Nothing dramatic had happened. And yet, in its own quiet way, the night had been full. Full of voices. Full of simple food. Full of warm light. Full of stories. Full of music. And full of the ordinary companionship that allowed people, for a few peaceful hours, to forget the long road of tomorrow and simply rest beneath the lamps of ancient Persia. As the night deepens, the tavern grows quiet. The night had now reached the quietest part of its journey. Beyond the tavern, the ancient town lay beneath a dark and peaceful sky. The last traces of activity had almost disappeared from the surrounding streets. Shops were closed, courtyards were silent, and the sounds of daytime work had faded completely. Only the occasional movement of an animal or the distant footsteps of a late traveler disturbed the stillness. Inside the tavern, however, a small circle of life remained. The oil lamps continued to burn. Their flames were lower than before, and their light had become softer. The walls no longer seemed brightly illuminated. Instead, the room existed in gentle layers of gold and shadow. The tables were quieter now. Most of the food had been eaten. The bread had almost disappeared. The bowls that had earlier been filled with dates, herbs, and simple dishes were mostly empty. A few clay cups remained beside the customers. Some still contained a little drink. Others had been placed upside down or pushed gently toward the edge of the table. The evening meal had become a memory. What remained was companionship. The people who were still inside had become comfortable with the room. They knew the sound of the lamps. They knew the smell of the food. They knew the voices of the people sitting nearby. Even strangers who had arrived only hours earlier no longer seemed entirely unfamiliar. The tavern had absorbed them into its quiet nighttime rhythm. A few people were preparing to leave. One customer gathered a small bundle of belongings. Another adjusted a cloak or outer garment against the coolness of the night. A traveler checked the things that would accompany them on the road the following morning. These movements were slow and deliberate. Nobody wanted to create unnecessary noise. The hour had become too peaceful for that. The tavern keeper moved quietly between the tables. Empty dishes were collected. Clay vessels were placed together. A few remaining pieces of food were covered or stored. The work continued without urgency. There was still cleaning to be done before the tavern could finally close, but the atmosphere was no longer that of a busy establishment. It had become almost domestic. The sounds were smaller now. A bowl moved across a wooden surface. Pottery touched pottery. A cushion was shifted. Someone coughed softly. Then silence returned. For those remaining, the room had become a place of rest. Some leaned against cushions. Others sat with their hands resting beside their cups. A few continued speaking in low voices. The subjects of conversation had become less important. There was no need to discuss business anymore. No need to exchange complicated information. The most serious matters of the day had already been dealt with. Now people could simply talk. Perhaps someone remembered a humorous moment from earlier. Perhaps two travelers quietly compared their journeys. Perhaps a local resident described a road or marketplace. Perhaps the conversation drifted toward memories of home. At this hour, conversations often wandered. One subject led to another. A name was mentioned. That name reminded someone of another person. That person brought back a memory. The memory became a story. And the story might eventually lead to laughter. But the laughter was soft. The walls seemed to encourage quietness. The night itself encouraged quietness. Even the people seemed to understand that the world outside was sleeping. There was something deeply different about an ancient town after midnight. Without modern lighting, darkness had much greater presence. A street could become almost completely black once the last household lamp was extinguished. A building could disappear into shadow only a few steps away. The sky above remained filled with stars. The moon, when present, could illuminate rooftops and courtyards with pale light. But most of the town belonged to darkness. The tavern's lamp therefore had importance beyond simple illumination. It created a small island of light. From the street, its glow could perhaps be seen through the open entrance. For a traveler moving through the darkness, that light would have been reassuring. It meant that somewhere nearby, people were still awake. There was warmth. There was shelter. There was food. There was human company. Inside, however, the people hardly noticed the importance of the light anymore. They had grown accustomed to it. The flame simply existed above them. The shadows moved gently across the walls. The room remained warm. The air carried the faint scent of oil, food, pottery, and wood. These smells belonged to the night. The tavern keeper checked one of the lamps. The oil was becoming low. The wick had burned for many hours. It was trimmed carefully. The flame briefly weakened. Then it rose again. The light returned to its earlier brightness. For a moment, the room seemed to awaken. A face appeared more clearly. A clay cup reflected the flame. A woven cushion showed its pattern. Then the brightness softened again. This simple process would have been familiar to anyone who lived in a world dependent upon lamps. Light was something that required attention. It was not automatic. It had to be prepared. Oil had to be stored. Wicks had to be maintained. Flames had to be watched. Every evening depended upon this small technology. And every night eventually brought the moment when the lamps were extinguished. For now, however, they remained burning. A few customers were not ready to leave. Perhaps the road outside was too dark. Perhaps their homes were farther away. Perhaps they simply preferred to remain where they were for another while. There was comfort in waiting. The darkness outside was not threatening when viewed from inside the warm room. It was simply night. A natural part of the daily cycle. The people inside could listen to the silence beyond the doorway. Sometimes a faint breeze entered. It moved through the room and caused the lamps to tremble. The flames leaned gently. The shadows moved. Then everything settled again. The night air was cool and clean. After the warmth of the tavern, the breeze felt refreshing. For travelers accustomed to long roads and open landscapes, the night air would have been familiar. It carried the scent of earth, dust, animals, plants, and distant fires. The town itself had its own nighttime smell. Cooking fires had mostly disappeared. Only a few households might still have embers glowing. The marketplace had become quiet. The streets held the coolness of the night. Above everything was the immense sky. The stars would have appeared brighter than they do over most modern cities. Without electric lights washing out the darkness, countless stars could be seen. The Milky Way could form a pale band overhead. For people in the tavern, the sky was not an abstract image. It was simply part of the world. They lived beneath it every night. The movements of the stars could help mark the passage of time. The moon could affect travel and nighttime visibility. The heavens were part of daily experience. Yet inside the tavern, attention remained close to home. A cup. A table. A lamp. A familiar voice. A warm room. The night did not need to be filled with extraordinary events. Its peacefulness came from repetition. The same things that had happened earlier were now happening more slowly. The final drink was poured. The last conversations continued. The remaining food was gathered. The lamps burned lower. One by one, people prepared themselves for sleep. A traveler might soon find a place to rest. A local resident might return home through the quiet streets. The tavern keeper would eventually close the entrance. But there was no need to hurry toward that moment. For now, the room remained open. The people inside were surrounded by the gentle sounds of the night. The world beyond the walls had become still. And the tavern itself seemed to be slowly becoming still as well. The voices faded. The movement slowed. The lamps continued to glow. The final hours of the evening had arrived. The Ancient Persian Tavern was no longer a place of gathering. It was becoming a place of farewell. And beneath the quiet lamps, the night seemed to whisper that soon everyone would return to sleep. Leaving the tavern had grown almost completely quiet. Only a few people remained beneath the fading glow of the oil lamps, and even their conversations had become little more than soft murmurs. The lively sounds of the earlier evening had disappeared one by one, leaving behind the gentle noises of a room preparing for sleep. The last pieces of bread had been gathered. The remaining dishes had been cleared. Clay cups stood in small groups upon the tables, waiting to be washed and stored. The scent of food still lingered in the air, but it had become faint. What remained most strongly was the smell of oil from the lamps and the cool night air entering through the open doorway. Outside, the ancient town was almost silent. The streets that had been busy during daylight now belonged to darkness. Closed shops stood behind their doors. Market stalls were empty. Courtyards were quiet. Animals rested in their shelters. Families had withdrawn into their homes. Only a few lamps could still be seen through doorways and small openings in the walls. The tavern was becoming one of the last places where people were still awake. This was the moment when the atmosphere of the evening changed once again. Earlier, the tavern had been a place of arrival. People had entered hungry or tired. They had found tables. Food had been served. Drinks had been poured. Stories had been told. Music had filled the room. Now the same people were preparing to leave. The change was gradual. There was no sudden announcement that the evening was over. Instead, people simply began collecting their belongings. A traveler checked a small bundle. Another adjusted a cloak. Someone made sure that nothing had been forgotten beneath a cushion. A final cup was lifted. A final sip was taken. Then the vessel was returned quietly to the table. The tavern keeper moved between the remaining customers, offering the final signs of hospitality. There was little conversation now. A few words of farewell. A gesture of thanks. Perhaps a brief discussion about the following morning. Then silence again. The ancient world moved according to different rhythms than modern life. There were no glowing clocks on the walls. No bright streetlights announcing the hour. No vehicles waiting outside. Night itself provided the strongest signal. When darkness became deep enough, people generally understood that the day was ending. The tavern's lamps made it possible to remain awake longer, but even they could not continue forever. Oil had to be conserved. The lamps required attention. And eventually, the room would return to darkness. For travelers, leaving at this hour required some thought. The road outside was difficult to see. A person walking through a dark street could rely upon moonlight, stars, familiar landmarks, or a small handheld lamp if one was available. But unnecessary travel after dark was not always desirable. For that reason, some travelers might have chosen to remain at the tavern or nearby lodging until morning. The tavern could therefore serve as a temporary stopping place. A traveler might sleep nearby after eating. Another might continue the journey only when daylight returned. The road would still be there in the morning. There was no reason to rush into darkness. Inside the tavern, the remaining people seemed to understand this quiet relationship with time. The night was not something to defeat. It was something to accept. Darkness had arrived. The world had become quiet. Soon it would be time to sleep. There was something peaceful about allowing the day to end naturally. The final lamp near the entrance flickered. Its flame leaned slightly when the breeze entered. The tavern keeper adjusted it. The light steadied. For another few minutes, the room remained illuminated. The walls looked warm. The tables appeared almost golden. The shadows gathered around the edges. Then another lamp was extinguished. One corner of the room disappeared into darkness. The remaining lamps suddenly seemed brighter. Their small circles of light became more noticeable. The room had grown smaller, quieter, more intimate. A final conversation took place near the doorway. Two people exchanged a few quiet words before separating. Perhaps they would meet again in the marketplace the following day. Perhaps they would never see one another again. Ancient life contained countless brief encounters like this. People crossed paths for an evening, shared food and stories, and then continued on separate journeys. Most such meetings were never recorded. They simply became part of memory. A traveler might remember a pleasant tavern years later. A local might remember an unusual visitor. A merchant might recall a story heard beside an oil lamp. These memories could remain long after the physical place had disappeared. The tavern itself might eventually change. Walls could be repaired. A roof could be rebuilt. A doorway could be widened. New owners could arrive. Perhaps one day the building would disappear completely. Yet on this particular night, it remained exactly what it had been for countless evenings before. A place where people could stop. A place where hunger could be satisfied. A place where conversation could make a long journey feel shorter. A place where the darkness outside could be forgotten for a while. One of the remaining customers finally stood. The movement was slow. After sitting for several hours, the body needed a moment to adjust. A cloak was gathered. A small bundle was lifted. The person paused near the doorway. The cool night air entered immediately. After the warmth of the tavern, the outside seemed much colder. The street was almost completely dark. Above the rooftops, the stars appeared incredibly bright. The traveler stepped outside. For a moment, the warm light from the tavern fell across the street. Then the figure moved away. The footsteps were quiet. They faded gradually. The tavern remained behind. Another customer left. Then another. Each departure made the room quieter. The number of voices decreased. The tables became empty. The lamps continued burning. Eventually, only the tavern keeper and perhaps a final guest remained. The evening had almost completely ended. The tavern keeper began the final tasks. The cups were collected. The bowls were stacked. The remaining food was covered. The tables were wiped. The cushions were arranged. Nothing was hurried. The work was familiar. It had probably been performed many nights before. And it would be performed again. The tavern's existence depended upon this quiet repetition. Every morning, it would open again. Every evening, people would return. Food would be prepared. Lamps would be filled. Cups would be cleaned. Tables would be arranged. And another night would begin. But tonight was almost finished. The final lamp near the back wall was extinguished. Darkness spread across the room. Only one small flame remained near the entrance. Its light reached across the floor. The tavern keeper paused. The room was silent now. The distant sounds of the sleeping town were barely audible. Then the last lamp was extinguished. For the first time since the evening began, the tavern was completely dark. The doorway was closed or secured. The building settled into silence. Outside, the stars continued to shine above the ancient Persian town. The people who had gathered beneath the lamps were now walking home, resting nearby, or preparing for sleep. The roads were quiet. The markets were still. The world had entered the deepest part of night. And the little tavern, which only a few hours earlier had been filled with food, conversation, stories, music, and laughter, had become still. Nothing remained except the memory of the evening. A warm meal. A simple cup. A shared story. A gentle melody. The glow of oil lamps. The sound of voices. The coolness of the night beyond the doorway. These ordinary moments had passed quietly, just as thousands of other evenings had passed before them. And now, beneath the immense Persian sky, the tavern rested too. The night had finally taken everything into its silence. Soon the first faint light of morning would begin to return. But for now, there was only darkness, stars, cool air, and sleep. Morning after the tavern. The first light. The night eventually began to loosen its hold upon the ancient Persian town. For many hours, the streets had remained dark and silent. The tavern had been closed, its lamps extinguished, its tables empty, and its doors secured against the cool air of the night. Above the rooftops, the stars had slowly crossed the sky. But now, almost imperceptibly, the darkness began to change. At first there was no obvious sunrise. The sky remained dark. The streets remained quiet. The houses still slept. Yet along the distant horizon, the deepest blackness began to soften into a faint shade of grey. Morning was approaching. Inside the tavern, the darkness remained complete. The clay cups and bowls sat where they had been placed the previous night. The tables were quiet. The cushions remained undisturbed. The faint smell of food still lingered in the room, mixed with the scent of extinguished oil lamps and cool plaster. Everything seemed to be resting. The tavern had finally become silent. Then, outside, the first signs of movement began. A bird called from somewhere beyond the rooftops. The sound was brief. Another answered from farther away. The town was beginning to wake. A donkey shifted in its shelter. Somewhere in a courtyard, a person moved. A door opened softly. The first sounds of morning were small. Nothing announced the beginning of the new day. There was simply a gradual return of life. The sky brightened by degrees. The stars closest to the horizon began to disappear. The rooftops slowly became visible against the lighter sky. The narrow streets remained empty, but they were no longer completely black. Morning had arrived quietly. For the people who had spent the previous evening in the tavern, the night was now becoming a memory. Some had already fallen asleep. Others were preparing to rise. Travelers would soon begin checking their belongings. Merchants would inspect their goods. Workers would prepare for another day. The tavern keeper would return to the room and begin the familiar work of opening the establishment. The cycle would begin again. A small lamp might be lit inside. Its flame would appear suddenly in the darkness, creating a tiny circle of warmth. The first light of the lamp would reveal the tables, the clay vessels, the cushions, the floor, the walls, the traces of the previous evening. The room would no longer look like the same place it had been several hours earlier. At night, it had been a gathering place. In the early morning, it became a workplace again. The tables needed attention. The vessels needed washing. The remaining food needed to be examined. Fresh water would need to be brought. New supplies might have to be prepared. Bread would need to be arranged. The tavern could not simply remain asleep. The new day required preparation. Outside, the town was becoming increasingly active. The eastern sky was now brighter. The first sunlight had not yet reached the streets, but the darkness had almost disappeared. People began moving through the lanes. Some carried baskets. Others led animals. A few travelers prepared to continue along the road. The quiet streets gradually became parts of movement. The marketplace remained mostly closed, but soon its doors would open. Vendors would bring out their goods. Customers would begin arriving. The familiar sounds of trade would return. The day would become busy. But for a few minutes, there was a peaceful period between night and day. This was the moment when the ancient town seemed to breathe. The night had ended. The day had not fully begun. The sky was pale. The air was cool. The streets were quiet. And the first sunlight slowly appeared beyond the horizon. Inside the tavern, the room began to brighten naturally. The lamp was no longer necessary. The doorway could be opened. Fresh air entered. It carried the smell of morning earth and distant cooking fires. The tavern keeper opened the entrance. The outside world appeared. The same street that had been almost invisible only hours earlier was now clearly visible. The walls of neighboring buildings caught the first pale light. The rooftops turned softly golden. Long shadows stretched across the ground. The town looked peaceful. For a moment, the tavern stood between two worlds. Behind it was the quiet memory of the night. Ahead was another busy day. The people who had gathered there had left their traces. Not in the form of anything grand. Only small things. A few marks upon the tables. A handful of crumbs. The faint smell of food. The arrangement of cushions. A few empty vessels. These were the physical remains of an ordinary evening. Yet those ordinary traces represented something larger. The tavern had been a place of connection. People who might never have met elsewhere had shared the same room. Travelers had exchanged news. Merchants had spoken about distant roads. Workers had rested after their day's labor. Stories had been told. Music had been played. Food had been shared. And for a few hours, the different lives of the people gathered there had overlapped. Now each person had returned to their own path. Some would wake in nearby homes. Some would continue their journeys. Some would return to work. Some would enter the marketplace. The tavern itself remained, ready to welcome another evening. This was the quiet truth of ordinary places. Their importance came not from a single remarkable event, but from repetition. Night after night, the same doors opened. The same lamps were lit. The same tables were prepared. People came and went. The building became part of the rhythm of the town. It might have been easy to overlook. It was not a palace. It was not a royal monument. It did not bear the name of a famous king. But places like this helped make ancient communities function. They offered food. They offered shelter. They offered companionship. They created opportunities for people to meet. And through these meetings, information and stories could move across society. The first sunlight now reached the tavern doorway. The darkness inside disappeared. The clay vessels looked ordinary again. The soft shadows of the night were gone. The room had returned to its practical appearance. A new day had begun. Outside, the town was waking more quickly now. Animals were being moved. Doors were opening. People were calling to one another. The marketplace was beginning to stir. The road beyond the town was becoming visible beneath the morning light. Travelers could now continue safely. The same roads that had seemed mysterious beneath the stars looked ordinary again. Dust became visible. Stone paths appeared. The landscape beyond the settlement emerged slowly from the morning haze. Somewhere along those roads, caravans would soon begin moving. Merchants would gather their animals. Goods would be loaded. Journeys would continue. The empire would begin another day of movement. But the tavern remained quiet for a little longer. The night's peacefulness had not entirely disappeared. The air inside was still cool. The tables were still empty. The doorway allowed sunlight to enter. For a brief moment, the tavern seemed to remember the evening that had passed. The warm lamps. The bread. The cups. The stories. The music. The laughter. The quiet conversations. All of it was gone now. But another evening would come. The sun would cross the sky. The marketplace would become busy. The roads would fill with people. The day's work would continue. And eventually, once again, darkness would descend upon the town. The lamps would be lit. The tables would be prepared. The doorway would glow. And people would gather. The ancient rhythm would repeat. For now, however, morning had arrived. The Persian town was waking beneath the first light. And somewhere inside the modest tavern, the remains of the previous night's peaceful gathering waited quietly for another day to begin. The tavern becomes a memory. Morning had fully arrived over the Persian town. The soft grey light of dawn had disappeared, replaced by the warmer brightness of the rising sun. The rooftops and walls were beginning to glow, and the narrow streets that had been silent throughout the night were slowly filling with movement. The tavern stood open once again. Its doorway allowed the morning air to pass freely through the room. The atmosphere was completely different from the night before. Only a few hours earlier, the same space had been filled with warm lamplight, quiet conversation, food, music, and the tired voices of travelers. Now the room belonged to daylight. The lamps had been extinguished. The shadows had disappeared. The tables were being cleaned. The clay cups were gathered and washed. The remaining dishes were examined and stored. The cushions were straightened. The room was being prepared for another day. Nothing about this work was dramatic. It was repetitive. And precisely because it was repetitive, it belonged to the deeper rhythm of life in the ancient world. A tavern could only welcome people at night because someone had prepared it during the day. Food had to be purchased. Water had to be carried. Vessels had to be cleaned. Fuel had to be obtained. Bread had to be prepared. Supplies had to be stored. The building itself had to be maintained. Every peaceful evening depended upon many quiet tasks that happened long before the first customer arrived. The morning therefore revealed another side of the tavern. At night, it had seemed almost magical beneath the oil lamps. In daylight, it was simply a working place. A practical building serving practical needs. The first customers of the new day would eventually arrive. Some might come for food. Others might be travelers preparing to continue their journeys. Workers might stop briefly. Merchants might seek breakfast before returning to the marketplace. The rhythm would begin again. Outside, the town was becoming increasingly busy. The marketplace was waking. Stalls were being opened. Goods were being arranged. Animals were being led through the streets. The sounds of bargaining and movement were slowly returning. The smell of cooking fires began to spread through the morning air. Bread was being prepared in homes and food establishments. The scent of smoke mixed with the freshness of morning. It was a completely different atmosphere from the deep quiet of midnight. The town belonged to daylight once again. Travelers who had rested through the night began preparing their belongings. A journey in the ancient Persian world required careful attention. Animals had to be checked. Water supplies had to be considered. Goods needed to be secured. The condition of the road ahead had to be understood. If the previous night's conversations had included information about the road, those words might now become useful. A traveler could remember a warning about a difficult stretch. A merchant might remember advice about a particular settlement. Someone might have learned that a caravan was leaving at a certain time. This was one of the quiet ways in which an evening in a tavern could influence the following day. Conversation did not disappear when people left. It traveled with them. A story heard at one table might be repeated at another. A piece of information might move along the road. A traveler could carry a rumor from one town to another. A merchant could pass news between markets. In this way, ordinary gatherings contributed to the movement of information across the Persian world. The tavern was only one small point in a much larger network. Roads connected settlements. Caravans connected markets. Messengers connected authorities. Travelers connected communities. And places where people gathered allowed all of these connections to become personal. A written message could carry information. A person could carry a story. The difference was that a person could also explain, question, remember, exaggerate, and interpret. This made spoken conversation powerful. It gave information a human voice. The previous night's visitors had therefore carried more than the memory of a meal. They had carried pieces of one another's worlds. A traveler had seen places that locals had never visited. A local had known details that travelers needed. A merchant had understood markets. A worker had understood the rhythms of the town. Each person possessed knowledge that someone else might find useful. The tavern created a temporary meeting point for these different forms of experience. Yet as the sun climbed higher, the memory of the evening slowly faded into ordinary life. The people who had laughed together beneath the lamps were now separated. The travelers were back on the roads. The merchants were thinking about business. The workers were returning to their tasks. The storyteller had become simply another person in the morning crowd. The musician had put away the instrument. The tavern keeper had returned to work. This was how most evenings ended. There was no dramatic conclusion. Life simply continued. Perhaps this is what made the experience of visiting an ancient Persian tavern so human. It was not an extraordinary event. It was a temporary pause. A place where people could stop being concerned with the next task for a little while. They could eat. They could drink. They could listen. They could speak. They could laugh. They could rest. Then they could continue. The great Persian Empire itself operated through similar rhythms. Royal officials governed. Armies moved. Taxes were collected. Roads were maintained. Cities grew. Buildings were constructed. Trade crossed enormous distances. But underneath all of those large movements were countless ordinary moments. A family preparing breakfast. A worker walking toward a workshop. A merchant loading an animal. A traveler checking a water container. A baker preparing bread. A tavern keeper cleaning a table after a night's gathering. History was built from these moments as much as from palaces and battles. The tavern therefore offered a quiet window into the everyday world. Its walls did not tell stories in the way monuments did. Its importance existed in what happened inside. The voices. The meals. The encounters. The small acts of hospitality. The simple routines. Over centuries, the building itself might disappear. Wood would decay. Plaster would crack. Roofs would collapse. New buildings might rise above the same ground. The people who had sat around the tables would eventually vanish from living memory. Their names would be forgotten. Their conversations would disappear. Their jokes would no longer be understood. Yet the human experience represented by that evening would continue. People would still gather. They would still share meals. They would still tell stories. They would still seek shelter after long journeys. They would still sit beneath warm light while darkness covered the world outside. The objects might change. The language might change. The buildings might change. But the need for companionship would remain. The morning sun now stood higher. The tavern was ready for another day. A few customers entered. A greeting was exchanged. A place was prepared. The ordinary cycle had already begun again. There was something reassuring about this repetition. The night had ended, but the tavern had not ended with it. The same doorway that had welcomed tired travelers beneath the stars now welcomed people beneath the morning sun. The same tables that had held cups and dishes at night were being prepared for another meal. The same walls that had listened to stories would soon hear new conversations. The same room would experience another evening when the sun eventually disappeared. Perhaps new travelers would arrive. Perhaps new stories would be told. Perhaps another musician would play. Perhaps another merchant would bring news from a distant road. Perhaps someone would sit quietly, simply enjoying a meal. The tavern did not need to know what would happen. It only needed to remain ready. As the day continued, the memory of the previous night became softer. The final notes of music were gone. The last conversations had ended. The warmth of the lamps had disappeared. Only the ordinary daylight remained. But somewhere in the minds of those who had been there, the evening remained. Perhaps a traveler remembered the bread. Perhaps someone remembered a particularly good story. Perhaps another remembered the music. Perhaps the tavern keeper remembered the faces of those who had come and gone. These memories were small. But small memories often form the texture of a life. The ancient Persian world was not experienced only through grand events. It was experienced through evenings like this. Through the smell of bread. Through the warmth of a lamp. Through the sound of a cup touching a table. Through a stranger's story. Through a quiet melody. Through the cool air entering a doorway after sunset. Through the simple comfort of knowing that, for a few hours, there was somewhere to sit. And so the visit to the Persian tavern came gently to its end. There had been no spectacular conclusion. No grand ceremony. No dramatic farewell. Only the gradual arrival of morning. The lamps went dark. The streets brightened. The people went their separate ways. The tavern opened again. And the ancient town continued. The sun climbed higher above the rooftops. The marketplace grew louder. The roads filled once more. The day began its familiar work. Yet somewhere within that busy morning remained the quiet memory of the previous night. A small room beneath the Persian sky. Warm lamplight. Simple food.